them speak at this time for 20 minutes. And so we'll have a lesson this evening and then one tomorrow evening. And so it's my pleasure at this time to introduce Josh Tubbs, who is a second-year student. He'll be graduating this year. And he has with him this evening his wife, Emily, her parents, and sister and nephew. And so I'd like to ask you all to stand, please. Let's show our appreciation for them being here. Josh grew up in Bowling Green, Kentucky, attended the Lehman Avenue congregation through high school and college. He comes to Southeast having already received a degree, a Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture and a certificate in Leadership Studies. He taught high school agriculture and served as FFA advisor for 5 years. And he attended the Grant County congregation where Jerry Carmichael encouraged him to attend Southeast. We're very proud of Josh. He has functioned as student representative this year, which has with it a number of duties throughout the year, and especially during lectureship week. So Josh, at this time, we invite you to come speak to us.
Good evening. I appreciate all of you being here this evening. I appreciate my family, my in-laws all coming to this evening. They traveled a couple hours to come visit with us, and I appreciate the time we've got to spend with them. And my nephew, it's different having an 18-month-old in the house, or 20-month-old in the house. He's almost 2 years old now, and it's a little different functioning like that. But it's been a fun weekend and a fun week so far. Our topic this evening is faith and grace at Jericho. And I don't know who decided they were going to give the students the toughest topics here, but I appreciate that. This topic has really challenged my thought process when it comes to faith and grace. And to give you an idea of what we're going to look at tonight, we're looking at how faith, grace, commands or laws, and actions or works show themselves at Jericho. And then we're going to relate that back to our New Testament Christianity and how faith, grace, commands, and laws balances itself out in the Christian life and our salvation. So we have 20 minutes to cover all that in the context of Jericho. We're going to move quickly through the context, but I want to back us up a little bit and get an idea of what's going on when these Israelites approached Jericho. We'll be in Joshua chapter 6 for most of the time, but if you back up into the wandering years, those 40 years they spent previous to crossing the Jordan in Joshua chapter 5, they lost an entire generation of people. Remember when the spies came back across and the nation kind of rebelled against Moses, the promise to God was they would wander 40 years. And not one of them over the age of 20 would survive that 40 years. So you have an entire generation that has passed. All this generation knows for the most part is wandering in the wilderness. They have fought 4 or 5 battles in the wilderness, not against fortified cities. The only thing that they have really known is God's provision during their time, and they've watched God fulfill that promise of no one over the age of 20 at the time of the spies coming back across, entering into Canaan to conquer Canaan land. All they know is God's provision. When we look at Hebrews 11, where we'll be later in our discussion, we see that the previous generation's statement of faith was the crossing of the Red Sea. And now this generation of Israelites makes their statement of faith. They have come 40 years, crossed the river, they have reaffirmed the covenant of Abraham, they have reaffirmed the Passover, and now God sends them to Jericho. But it's their actions in this 1 week that is their faith statement made in Hebrews. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell. Their faith in that 1 week results in one of the greatest conquests of the Israelite nation, one of the greatest conquests of God's people. So in this story, we see a meeting of grace, faith, commands or laws, and actions, or what we know as works, displayed in such a way that we can understand God's will for us as New Testament Christians. So let's look at the text starting in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 1. And we're going to look at the instructions given at Jericho. We're going to look at faith and grace. Then we're going to look at commands and laws as a group. And then we're going to come back to the conclusion of the capture of Jericho. And I'm going to leave you with a couple of statements. In Joshua chapter 6 and verse 1, the city of Jericho was shut against the Israelites. The people of Jericho already knew of the conquest of God's people. You see, in Joshua chapter 2, when Rahab hid the spies, her statement to them in Joshua chapter 2 and verse 10 and following, "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is the God of heaven above and on earth beneath." The people of Jericho knew God. And instead of realizing that they were doomed, they shut God out. Instead of going to battle, they closed it up so tight nobody could get in, nobody could get out. And the options for battle were limited. However, at the same time, this is a physical obstacle that the Israelites have not seen before. Remember, their battles before have been in the wilderness. Their battles before have not been against fortified cities. And Manner states it in his commentary as this: Israel's presence surely strikes fear in Jericho, but conversely, Jericho probably impresses the Israelites. Until this point, they have not encountered a wall city of Jericho's size. They don't know what to do. They don't have the training, the military training. They don't have the understanding of military tactics to go about taking down a walled city. But God, as He always does, has a solution. Despite the perceived magnificence of Jericho, God says to Joshua in chapter 6 and verse 2, "I have given Jericho to you, its kings and all its people." He has given them the city. Hess calls this soon-to-be victory a gift. Jericho is a gift from God. In a very similar way, Paul calls grace a gift from God in Ephesians 2 and chapter 8. "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, not of yourselves, it is the gift of God." Grace and Jericho are both very much a gift. Although the city was given as a gift to them, although the city was handed to them by God, it does not preclude or excuse their action. It does not preclude them taking action upon God's word. God gave explicit instructions to Joshua for the city of Jericho to be given to the Israelites. He follows this statement in verse 2 with verses 3, 4, and following. And in those verses, he gives some very explicit instructions. March around the city once a day for 6 days. March around the city 7 times on the 7th day. On the seventh time around, on the seventh day, the 7 priests that are going to march around with the Ark of the Covenant are going to blow their trumpets. And then finally, the people are going to shout with a great shout. Very detailed instructions upon how they are going to take on this city. What I find to be, from my limited military knowledge, a very odd tactic. And I would think from Joshua's viewpoint, having been in a few battles, thinking to himself, God, are you sure about this? I'm going to do it because you told me to, but I'm thinking this is kind of out there. I mean, we're not even going to pull a sword out. We're not going to try to climb the walls of the city and kill the people. We're just going to march around the city. All right, if you said to do it, we'll do it. And he does. He tells the people what to do. But think about what God has done in this situation. He has given them some instructions to take on a city, conquering them through ceremony. Conquering them through actions, but not necessarily battle. God is the master of physical battle, and he proved that against Og and Sihon with untrained men, and now he's proving that he's also the master of psychological warfare to a degree. Let's paint this picture in our mind. We have a walled city, 840 feet below sea level, walled, most likely on an elevated plain within that valley, where they could see everything coming around them. Jericho's built on an oasis in the middle of the desert. They can see everything for miles. They already know about the crossing of the Red Sea. They know about the defeat of these other kings, and here come the Israelites. Remember, all the men of fighting age are to be in this group who march around the city. When we read Numbers, we see at the conclusion of their wandering, the census shows over 600,000 men of fighting age. The population of Knoxville, Tennessee is about 180,000 people. The population of Lexington, Kentucky is about 200,000 people. You have a front guard of 300,000 people. Almost 2 times the population of the city that we're in right now. You have 7 priests and the Ark of the Covenant, the very presence of God, which the people of Jericho would be aware of. Then 300,000, men in the rear guard. Think about taking all the people of Knoxville and all the people of Lexington and lining them up in a circle with priest and an Ark of the Covenant in the middle and marching in circles. Day 1, the people who live in the city wall, we know they lived in the city wall because that's where Rahab's house was when she lowered the spies out, would be watching. What would they do? They'd tell their friends and neighbors. Day 2, more people are coming to the wall, wanting to see what is happening with these Israelites. They're losing their mind. Day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, it builds. More and more people are wanting to see what these crazy Israelites are doing walking around our city. Day 7, they change the plan a little bit. All these people of Jericho in the walls, watching, gathering as they march a second time. Go tell your brother, they're marching again. It's different today. Go tell Mom, get up here. She wants to see this. Lap 3, 4, 5, and 6. And everybody in Jericho is gathering around wanting to know what 500,000 people are doing circling our city. And they stop that 7th time around. David gives the command, the trumpets blow, and the people shout, and the walls start falling. You've got all these people in the walls. Has he played a mind game with them? And I'm not speculating. I'm thinking this is probably most likely what's going to happen. What are we going to do? We're going to be attracted to things that are different. They are probably out of their mind right now trying to figure out what God is doing and what the people of Israel are doing. This battle, when executed precisely, was organized to succeed in a display of God's power. The end result was a presentation of God to his people of his ability to defeat man. Nevertheless, God has given the orders in such a way that Hamilton points out the emphasis then, because of their actions, is upon faithful implementation of orders received from a superior. All they did was did what they were told, and they were successful. And that is one lesson that I think we can learn no matter what stage, age we are in life or where we're at. If we do what we're told and it's the right thing to do, we're going to be successful. But it's also at this point we see this mingling of grace, faith, law, and works in play. Faith and grace at Jericho. We understand that grace is a gift from God, according to Ephesians 2, verses 8, and we pointed that out earlier. That verse also states that this grace is accessed by faith. In Hebrews 11 and verse 30, we already mentioned that. It was by faith the walls of Jericho fell. At the same time, many people will argue about how faith and grace work together. We see a prime example here. Now, remember, it's called a gift in Ephesians 2 and verse 8, but I want to make a note that never do we find grace called a free gift. Why is it not called a free gift? It doesn't cost me anything to access it other than my faith. I don't earn. Grace is defined as unmerited favor. I can't earn it. I don't deserve it. There's nothing I do to gain it. But every gift comes with a cost. The cost is always on the gift bearer. Remember that when we study grace and faith, the cost always comes from the gift bearer. Yeah, a gift may not cost me anything, but the gift bearer has to pay for it. And we'll get to that in a moment. But what it tells me is that God's grace is contingent upon faith and all that faith entails. And when we read Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, we see that faith is involved in that. God's grace is also discretionary according to his laws. And we'll read Ephesians 2 and verse 10 in a moment to justify that. But we have extremes on every belief, it seems. We have those that take the faith alone view, and we have those that take the kind of works-based mentality, and we have to balance out the two. We cannot put ourselves in a place where we have a checklist of things that we think we earn our salvation by, and we cannot go so far as to justify misbehavior. The faith-only or free grace theology describes faith as purely intellectual assent. Yet Hebrews 11, 1 through 3 shows us that faith is based on evidence and understanding. Faith is not purely intellectual assent. There is more to it than that. If salvation is based on this faith-only viewpoint, then God doesn't require anything of us. And we see at Jericho, God required some things of his people. To accept the teachings of free grace, we are to go against, our faith only, we are to go against what God has clearly taught us in his word. We owe a debt far greater than we can ever pay. And he forgives us that debt, though we do not deserve it. That is grace. But that does not free us from obligation to his commands. You see, the faith-only viewpoint is clearly refuted in James 2 and 17. Faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. In James 2 and 19, you believe that there is one God, you do well, even the demons believe and tremble. I do not want to be associated with such a belief as the demons. So we must be careful not to run to the extreme to justify everybody's sins that we all go to heaven. But at the same time, we have commands and action at Jericho. God gave commands, and the people took action. In 2 chapters in Romans, we see Paul makes a couple of statements. One in chapter 2 and verse 13, for not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. And then a chapter later, he says to us that we're justified by faith alone, apart from our works, our deeds of the law. We're justified by faith, apart from the deeds of the law. But he says it's the doers of the law who are justified. And we have to look at those two things together and not separate. Barnes points out, though, and Paul also, in Romans chapter 1, that there is an obedience to the faith. Barnes makes this statement: in order to produce or promote obedience to the faith, that is, to induce them to render that obedience to God which faith produces, there are two things therefore implied. That the design of the gospel and of the apostleship is to induce men to obey God, and that the tendency of faith is to produce obedience. There is no true faith which does not produce that. And he's talking about obedience. James lets us know that Abraham's faith was perfected by his works. Paul states we are free from the law in Romans chapter 7, but we have to remember that does not take away our obligation to do God's will. Dr. Lipe, in one of our classes, he probably mentioned this in more than one class, but faith requires action, and there's a couple of things that fulfilling God's commands require. And one is doing what God says, that's the command. How God says it, that's the action. And for the reasons God said it, that's the motivation, our faith. And so we must remember that faith requires action. 5 conclusions that are drawn from Jericho and the New Testament faith. Faithful obedience is an expectation of God. Faith must manifest itself in the prepared works that God has put before us, Ephesians 2 and verse 10. Grace is a gift, but it is conditional. Grace is contingent upon faith and discretionary according to God's law. And finally, the argument of justification by faith or the justification by works finds its resolution in the blood of Christ. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was for me, and it was for you. And that should move us to faithful obedience, to do what he wills us to do. My faith must result in obedient acts according to God's commands to receive God's grace. And God will always fulfill his promises to the obedient. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Josh. I, of course, have that task of trying to keep everything going, and Josh is on his way to being a great preacher, don't you think? He ignores the time.